Hello there. In this video, I'm going to be showing how we can quickly create a dynamic font asset for TextMeshPro to support Chinese, Japanese, and Korean characters. Now, I'm creating this video to help out a few users and to sort of show how the workflow has significantly improved since the introduction of the dynamic system in TextMeshPro. Now, this system was initially introduced in version 1.4, and it was later further improved in version 1.5 with the introduction of the multi-atlas texture support. Now, right now I'm running Unity 2018.4.21 F1. I'm running Preview 9 of version 1.5 of TextMeshPro. Preview 9 is not released yet. It will be out within the next few days or so, but there's nothing of what I'm going to be showing right now that's dependent on Preview 9. Preview 8 is the latest that's currently available. So again, 1.5.0-Preview 8 is for 2018.4. Version 2.1.0-Preview 8 is for 2019.x, and version 3.0.0-Preview 8, Preview 8 being the common thing between all these versions, which means they have feature parity. That one is for 2020.x. So without further ado, let's take a look at how we can create a dynamic font asset to support Chinese, Japanese, and Korean character. So step one, very important step, is to pick the right font file. Font files come in all shapes and sizes, and they all have different glyph coverage. So it's important to pick a font file that will support the languages you want. Now, a couple good places to get font files. There's lots of places on the internet. I like Google Fonts because you can figure out sort font files by language and language coverage, which makes it a lot easier to find font files with the characters and the languages you want. Another good place is Fonts or My Fonts. They have over 100,000 fonts. There's a bunch of free fonts. There are commercial fonts with different licensing arrangements and prices. So those are two good places that I use often. But again, font files are all over the place. So here I've imported my Noto Serif CJK regular in Unity. The way we're going to create a dynamic font asset is pretty straightforward. I'll show the old way. So in the old way is we would go to Window and we would bring up the font asset creator. And this is still what we're going to use to create static font asset, kind of. But we would use that to create static font asset, and I'll explain the kind of, because it just has like the ability to better pack and use a more optimized packing algorithm to fit more stuff and so on and so forth. But using the font asset creator required some knowledge of the Unicode, more specifically the Unicode ranges for the languages you wanted to support, or to have a text file that contains all the characters that you want to add to this thing. But since the introduction of the dynamic SDF system, to be honest, I haven't used the font asset creator in months because the dynamic system now allows me to do everything I want to do without necessarily having to go there. I would go to the font asset creator much later in the production time frame when I'm trying to bake and create my final assets, which will be a combination of static and dynamic for best performance and visual and rendering quality and so on and so forth. So I will skip over the font asset creator and I'll go back and show the whole thing about dynamic. So how do we do and create a dynamic font asset? Well, we're going to select our font file, and right clicking, you can go through the create menu and whatever stuff, but it's going to be off screen. So I'm going to go up here because it's the same thing. So you would go to select the you'd select the font file, go to create, and then you go TextMeshPro and you'd say font asset. Now, because I do this step literally like over 100 times a day, I don't use the menus because that's insane. I always misclick. So I added a menu shortcut, which is Shift Control F12. So select it, Shift Control F12, and voila, we have our dynamic font asset. Now, if I select it, it's going to show that, look, it's a dynamic font asset created for this font. Here's the rendering modes that are available. Now, when I described the dynamic system here, I didn't say dynamic SDF, so I'm trying to change how I reference it. We can also do bitmap font assets, so it does all of the above. So here we can see created dynamic font asset, sampling point size of 90, padding of 9, atlas texture of 1024 by 1024. Now I'm going to expand the font asset just to show a couple of things. We're going to look at its atlas texture, and I will lock my inspector. This is why I have a second one, so we can look at the atlas. if we look at its atlas, although I specified I wanted 1K by 1K, the atlas texture size is 0 by 0. This is by design. This is the way that we can minimize the size of these dynamic font assets in your build, because when you ship them, they should be empty because they're designed to capture stuff. And there's no point adding a texture that's completely empty that takes a megabyte or 4 MB in your build when they're empty. So by default, dynamic font assets, their atlas textures are uninitialized. Like the texture exists because it's here on file, it's an asset, but it has no size, so it takes no space. But when we add the first character, it will get sized to the proper size. So now let's go use it and see what's going to happen. So I'm going to create a text object. Go to create. I'll create a normal TextMeshPro object, which is on screen here. I'm going to go off screen and grab some text that I will copy paste in there. And I'm going to paste the text. And now what we see is a bunch of squares. Well, what is this? Well, in font world, this square is the glyph at index 0 in a font file. This is specifically designed to let the user know, or us, the developer, that our font, which is Liberation Sans, doesn't have these glyphs. And this is the whole purpose of this square thing. Yes, it's ugly, but it's designed to tell us something, which is, hey, whatever font I'm trying to use, it doesn't support those characters. So this is by design. Now, let's see what happens when we assign our Noto Sans dynamic font asset. Take a look at the texture here, and at the same time look at what's going to happen on screen. So I'm going to take it, drag it here, and boom, suddenly all the characters were added. They're added to our atlas texture, and it just happened as we did it. Now I could go on the next line and type some gibberish just to add more stuff. And as you can see, the characters pile up in our atlas texture. So this is the whole point with the dynamic system. Now at any time, I could, just for fun, erase this entire text. I could go back to my font asset and you say, you know what, I want to reset it. So I'm going to hit reset, boom, everything's been erased, and we're back to square one. Now, something that's important to understand about the dynamic system, changes to dynamic font assets in the editor, changes are persistent. However, in a build at runtime, those changes are not persistent. They will only live for a play session. This means that anytime a user starts your game again, all these assets are reset back to their default state, which is a good thing because then you don't have to worry about them growing to a point where they're full and they're overflowing with characters. But assuming we had to worry about that, let's talk about the multi-atlas texture feature that I described earlier. So I'm going to go back to my font asset and I'm going to hit undo just so we can bring the text back. And now obviously we just saw the glyphs show up again. I'll go back to it and I'll enable this multi-atlas texture support. And I'm going to do something silly. I'm going to change my atlas size to a 256 by 256. Now, when I say silly, why? Well, the sampling point size is 90 with a padding value of 9. This basically means that every single glyph takes about 100 pixel by 100 pixel size. So obviously in a 256 by 256, I can barely fit 4 in there. So when I click apply, watch what happens here and watch what happens on screen. Because as I click apply, we're asking the font asset to give us all these characters, right? So when I click apply, we didn't see anything happen. Well, yes, this obviously changed, but we didn't see any changes to the text. Now I bring this up because on the forum and in different posts, I've said that there's a significant performance overhead when you're using dynamic font assets versus static. And that is because in a static font asset where the character is already rendered in the texture, we already have a glyph table and a character table, it's a simple lookup and we're done. But in a dynamic system, we're having to go open the font file to look for the character, then render it into a texture and so on and so forth. And that is, it's got a pretty significant performance overhead. But this significant performance overhead is in compute time, not human time. And what I mean by that is adding a bunch of glyphs. When I click apply, we rastered, like, I don't know, I'm not going to count the characters, but 20 something or 30 something characters, and we didn't even see anything flinch. So in human speed, It is so much faster than anyone could ever type anything. And the point of the system is you're going to use static font assets for all the text that is known in your project, contained in your menus, UI, and all that stuff, because you know you're going to need those anyway. But anything else that's going to come from user input, that is where you're going to use the dynamic system or dynamic fallbacks to catch whatever characters the users may be typing. And since the performance in that context is substantially faster than anyone can type, the process of opening the font file, getting the glyph, adding it to a texture will be 100% transparent to any user, even on super slow devices. And that's the point. What I'm trying to avoid when I describe it as it's got a performance overhead is I want to avoid users using 100% dynamic on everything, where your game starts and you have like a title page with 1,000 characters, and now suddenly we have to go fetch 1,000 characters you knew you needed to display anyway. Like, why use dynamic? Like, and I don't mean to be mean, but don't be lazy, right? Let's do it. It's the equivalent of saying, look, in an update loop, I'm going to go find component by name, get component, and do string concatenation to generate as much garbage as I can. So in the world of text, which is the world I live in, I'm a text nerd, this is the equivalent of doing that when you're running full dynamics. So just avoid that, best practice. But back to the demo. So here we saw that when I changed these generation settings to 256 by 256, obviously we can't fit that many characters in a single atlas. But look at what happened here. As needed, additional atlas, I'll unlock this inspector, but as needed, additional atlas textures were created to give us the characters that we need. So the cool thing about what I explained about changes are persistent in the editor and they're not at runtime and so on and so forth, where I was also going is there's a revised workflow that you can now use, which is that while you're developing the project, run full dynamic. Why? Because you're developing. Performance is not that much of an issue at that point. And flexibility of the development is what's more important. And when I'm saying run full dynamic, just like I did, create a font asset. Don't be silly and make it a 256 by 256, because that's really silly. And I'll tweak that shortly for some other stuff I want to show. But create a normal dynamic STF font asset, enable multi-atlas texture, and just start working. And this will ensure that as long as your font file had the characters that to support the languages you're going to be developing and supporting, everything is going to show up on screen and it's all going to work. Then at some point in the development process, you're going to have to figure out how you're going to deal with localization and how are you going to break up and address all the different languages that you're targeting. Are you going to try to ship one single font asset primary with a bunch of fallbacks to cover different languages? Or are you going to use a variety of font assets, some static, some dynamic, and rely on asset bundles to load specific payloads for a specific language based on language selections? I mean, there's going to be a lot of options and choices you're going to have to make. But at that time is when you're going to decide, when you know what languages you're going to support and what all the known characters are for a given language or groups of languages. And when I say given language or groups of languages, for instance, French, English, Dutch, Spanish, German, whatever, it doesn't make sense to create specific font assets just for them because we all share the same character set. However, for Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and a bunch of other languages that have unique character sets, it makes sense to have those be on their own. So once you figure out what you need for each language, then you're going to go bake a static font asset that contains all the known text in your menus, UI, and so on and so forth. And then you will assign as fallback to this primary static one a dynamic font asset with multi-atlas texture enabled on it. And its job will be to capture whatever a user may type to make sure it shows up on screen. And back to changes not being persistent at runtime, you're not going to have to worry about a user typing so many characters over so many months that it's going to fill up the dynamic asset, because every time they end the play session and start a new one, that dynamic font asset will reset back to its native state of 0 by 0. So this will give you a very flexible system to deal with all that stuff. So let's go back to all these atlases. So at some point in the development process, when you're going to go back to try to figure out how to structure the final sort of iteration of your font assets, you might realize, well, look, this was kind of dumb to have a 256 by 256. What happens if I switch to a 512 by 512? Right now, let's watch what happens here. Watch again what happens on screen. When I click apply, we see nothing, and yet it's readjusted our atlases where now it says, well, you know what? Now that you're telling me 512 by 512, I only need 2 atlases to support this. If I go back again and I say, look, you know, I was again being silly, 1K by 1K is fine. Apply, and we're done. We're back to a single one. So this process of what I just did, when you change generation settings, the system will look at what's currently included in the font asset, and it will apply the changes to the setting and re-inject all the stuff that was in the font asset to begin with. Meaning, if I look at this font asset, it has 49 characters, and these 49 characters, let me reopen it. These 49 characters point to a glyph, like 0 points to glyph 17. So character is the thing that has the Unicode, and they reference a glyph. The glyph is the visual representation of the character. So if I go back here and we look at glyph 17, it's our 0. So this font asset contains 49. If I say, you know what happens? Let me zoom in just for fun. And I'll zoom in to make this big. What happens if I change my sampling point size to 20? Like pretty low, really low. Look at what it did to our glyph. Let's go back to 150, just because we can. We still have 49 characters all the time. So this keeps track of our characters. So in the editor, you can mess with these things to get whatever you want to figure out what's the, at what sampling point size does the glyph look best. And by the way, when I did this 20 thing, zoomed in, it looks horrible, right? And I don't recommend using 20. For Chinese, Japanese, and Korean characters, you can get away with about 36 to 40. I've heard some users getting good results at 18, which I think is nuts. But nuts in the sense that if it's like input field type text, I mean, again, this to me looks horrible zoomed in. But it's often important to pay attention to how big is this text going to be on screen, because at 20 right now, I'm not sure if I go from 20 to 150, did we see any change? Not really. So this also makes it pretty easy now to play around with all these settings to figure out, what's most optimum. Now, because of the dynamic system with multi-atlas, it's not as significant, but when you're trying to bake your static font asset and you're going to be trying to fit as many glyphs in there as you can, be able to play with the sampling point size and all that stuff to get a quality that you feel is good while being able to pack as many glyphs in there is the whole point. So I will wrap up this video because I didn't want to make it so long, but I wanted to show how quickly you can now create a dynamic font asset to just make it work. And again, just to show what I did, I will erase all the text. I'm going to select the font asset, and let's say I want to reset it back to its native state. We'll look at its atlas and we'll lock it. So I'll select it here, and I'm going to go to the context menu up here. You can't see the option because it's off screen, but it says reset. This is a modified version of reset. It will maintain the major settings, but it will wipe the atlas texture, and obviously reset does clear our atlas table. But if I go back and undo a bunch of times, which will undo the text that I deleted here, you'll see that they end up right back in our atlas just the way we had it. And again, just in case somebody skips to the end of the video, I'm going to delete the text object. I will delete this font asset that I created. I'm going to create a new one from Notosan CGK, Control-Shift F12. I'll create another one, Control-Shift F12. I'm going to go here, create a text object. I'll go back to wherever my text came from. Whoops. I'll copy paste this. copy paste. Here's, again, I did the same thing that I did before, which is we have we have Liberation Sound, which doesn't have the glyph coverage. I'm going to use Noto Sound CGK here. I will Control D to duplicate the text object, slap another one below, and drag the other font file, and then we can see the difference between those two fonts in terms of the design of the character set. So this is it for this video. It was meant to be a short video, but I guess I still managed to make it like close to 15 to 20 minutes. My apologies for that. This, by the way, is not the clean video I wanted to make. It's just one to help out a user to just quickly show this process. So I hope this was beneficial. I will post this on the Unity forum. If you have any questions or if you want me to provide more information about specific things that I covered, feel free to post on the forum and ask these questions, and it will be my pleasure to answer. Thank you for watching.